Right, I hope you had a pleasant tea break. So we're going to kick off with cyber investigation and cyber events and the question around cyber risk. Yeah, if we can get this up. So the major question that we want to deal with primarily is to find out what defines the space, what happens in that space, and how do we respond within this space. So there are basically two aspects of the cyberspace. The one is what we call the transactional space, and then there we have all events that are taking place by digital format. The second part of it is, of course, the hardware and the software in terms of which these digital transactions are taking place. So immediately we can see that the response is going to be a digital one. And when we investigate this, it's called, in the normal vernacular, digital investigations or digital forensics. But what it means is we're performing an investigation function within a space defined by noughts and zeros in code. And things we can't see with a naked eye. And that's why we have to use specific forensic technology techniques to execute this investigation function. And primarily, it is firstly about how we gather information. So normally, that happens by digital evidence recovery. Secondly, we deal with cyber investigation or cyber analysis, which takes place on analyzing the code and analyzing the software that's being used. And then thirdly, data analytics, and primarily for purposes of understanding what was the impact of the event that's taken place, and secondly then to determine or enhance the analysis that we do of software that's being used in the transaction to work out what has happened. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit later. We first want to talk a little bit more around the space. So normally cyber risk is determined as any risk of financial loss, reputation loss. We've heard that earlier this morning. Even in the cyberspace environment, there's a risk of reputation. And again, in some ways, that risk is bigger and more profound than pure financial loss. There's the disruption of our services, and then in general, we will find that we also have information losses. Now, information is an important aspect or important factor in the cyber risk environment because that leads the threat actor to gain financial gain at a later stage when at his leisure. So you want to remove information out of a system to be used at a later stage for financial gain. When we look at the trajectory of cyber risk evolution, we will see in the earlier years we had things called viruses and worms, denial of service attacks, and then over time, and that was not a long period of time, about 15 years, it sort of increased via scamming and botnets, where we used large amounts of computers to attack a system, to malware as a service, where now you can buy malware online. You have big syndicates who would develop it for you at a price. We have ransomware, which is something which is fairly recent in its development and use. Hacktivists and sophisticated syndicates, which are participating in the process and driving it. And then we have what's sort of at the top of the heap at the moment is targeted attacks. And this is the use of malware which is injected into your system by a threat actor, and they have specific purpose for that malware. And some of that malware becomes very sophisticated, as we will see a bit later. And we think next up is going to be the concept of cyber war. That's how wars are going to start in future. Into the future, this risk is going to increase exponentially because we're going to have more users, more smartphone connections, more IP-connected devices, more network traffic, and more data. Each one of us sitting doing something on our cell phone or our smartphone right now is entering into a network. And your data is on there, your connection on that network. The person next door does exactly the same. in 2019, that is going to increase threefold. This is purely on the transactional side. Then we have the devices. We have wearable devices. Apple is selling you Fitbits and all sorts of things. We have tablets. They're going to increase. The more people there are in the world, the more they get connected, the more the devices are going to be. The public market size of cloud storage spaces. Nobody wants to have anything on their machine anymore, anything in their own servers. We shunt it into the cloud. That's a fantastic ground for threat actors in the cyberspace to get information from. You don't even control that anymore. Somebody else controls that. And IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. That is the future. If you accept that in the future, a lot of the menial tasks that are currently performed by humans are going to be performed by machines, this is where the threat is going to climb towards. And the question is, have we protected against it? So what we typically find is that the cyber threat increases, but the controls are always lagging behind because it's seen as a cost constraint until we are hit. Right. Let's consider, when we further define the space of cyber risk, what are the things that's motivating people? Now, previously we had a lot of activism when it was still a game to be able to hack into somebody's system or computer and do naughty things on it. It was purely a game and it was done for fun. But then the activists started to get an ideological purpose. They wanted to make a statement, and for that we would, and primarily today, that is what we find them to do. And when I go through some of the examples, we will deal with one which is called anonymous. Organized crime, we have to understand that these days, this is big business. It is not considered, or those executing on cyber crimes are seeing it as big business. They are well resourced, they fund it, they are able to buy the best hackers in town, they are able to buy runners by the million. They are exploiting financial need in society, and therefore your organized crime gangs or syndicates are well funded, well resourced, and therefore they are able to buy and or create the most sophisticated malware. It's a formidable foe, very difficult to detect. In many cases where we are actually investigating cybercrime, we can explain what happened, we can explain the crime, we can explain the loss, we can help a client with recovering loss against an insurance contract, but we cannot find the perpetrator. You have a fair idea where they are. Sometimes we can explain out of what region of the world they come by virtue of the nature of the software they used and the way it's being constructed. But very difficult to find. Insiders, people within the organization, especially in prior years, we would find that a cyber event can actually not take place with the help of an insider. These days, they are less prevalent. You still get a lot of insiders who are participating, but they're less prevalent in the execution simply because of the sophistication by virtue of which many of the software operates. The malware have become military grade, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then state-sponsored events. They do seem to take place, and when we look at the trajectory of cyber events, they are probably going to be on the increase. So what's being stolen? Primarily, it's money. As I said to you, it's being considered as a business. So the primary purpose of most cybercrime is to extract money from another organization to yourself. In South Africa, we estimate that we lose about 80 million a day. That's about 750 million rupees on a daily basis. That's going out of the normal official financial system. From an information point of view, they would look at it. Your threat actor has got three purposes for information that they need. Information that is valuable, customer, supplier, personnel data, because in that sort of information, there's information that they can monetize. If I have your ID number, if I have your bank account number where your salary is being paid to, I can get money out of your bank account, believe me. Basic critical or business critical information, financials, business plans, strategy, strategy type documents. And why would they need that? Because they sell that to your competitor. Again, they monetize it. Valuable information. How many times do we lie the strategy, the business strategy document on the table? How many times it's on a computer? How many times do we transact it out of an unprotected environment to a protected or unprotected environment? It's subject to being taken by your cyber criminal. And then lastly, we talk about critical business transactions, raising of finance, corporate actions. Again, this is information that is valuable for competition. This is where we talk about industrial espionage. It's what it's being used for. How does it impact us? When you get hit, and this is where organizations normally don't tally the full cost up. They think if 50 million rupees have been stolen, that's the cost. It is not the cost. It is not only the cost. Firstly, do we have an intellectual property loss? If so, the cost is virtually unquantifiable. We don't know what the impact is. Our intellectual property has got a certain value, which we need to monetize in our business. When it's lost, somebody else will monetize it, or they will detract from your ability to monetize it. That cost can be uncalculable, and sometimes we cannot actually work out how much it is. Time lost due to investigation, managing media, regulatory authorities. It takes months and months and months of dedicated management time and time of service providers to help you to unravel the problem and recover from it. Some of it is not quantifiable directly in cash out that you pay. Obviously, for your consultants, it's an amount that you pay out. Reputation loss. Nobody wants to bank with a bank that is open to hackers. You put your hard-earned money into the bank, you want to know that the bank looks after your money. If they're not, you're not going to bank there. And that means business disappears. Property loss, simple money out. Penalties, legal and regulatory. Sometimes we pick up regulatory penalties as a result of events that's taken place, primarily because there's then an investigation and they find that we haven't complied with the requirements. And then the admin effort or the management time that goes into it. So if we look at some of the recent attacks, ransomware, WannaCry, probably the latest one of these. It's a simple effort or question of the threat actor injecting code into your system or program into your system. It either renders your devices inoperable or lock them, or it encrypts your information. That normally comes with a request for a ransom. This creates, more often than not, a fair amount of angst and uncertainty and stress within the organization because you don't know exactly what the problem is. Your operations are being impacted and impeded, and eventually you are convinced to pay. Our advice to our clients is you never pay. Once you've paid, the first time you've paid them, they will come again. You've got to make sure that you are not in a position where a ransomware attack will render your operation inoperable. So you've got to have proper backups, make sure that your firewalls are in place. You've got to have intelligence-based analysis within your system to make sure that it picks up any attack from a ransom activist. And by the way, sometimes they take a chance. They will send an email to you and say that your computers have been locked or your information has been encrypted or it's going to happen within the next hour or so. Please pay. They have some sense of humor as well. But the major objective here is to extort money, and it works regularly. It's like a 419 Nigerian type scam. Whilst we all warn against it, and whilst we all say we will not be caught by this, once your information is encrypted, the stress builds up, and people start thinking of, well, should we not pay the money? Never do that. In Germany, for instance, 32% of companies have fallen victim to a ransomware attack. It's prevalent. Some of them are quite severe, and yet it's not all over. When you have enough time and you have somebody on call who can decipher and re-engineer the encryption software, you can get out of it. But we should not panic when it happens, and that's the biggest threat here, is the sense of panic that's being induced. As I said earlier on, not ethical hackers, but hackers who previously were script kiddies trying just to access a system to say we've accessed it. This aspect has changed. There's this Argentinian outfit called Anonymous, and they are promoting some form of a social or messaging that they want to get across. So they would hack an organization, they would leave their calling card, and they would explain why they hacked the organization. And then they publish this fact. And then you read in the newspapers that organization X were hacked by Anonymous. They've left their calling card, and they've disclosed some information of your organization which is bad for reputation. It's still a problem because it affects our reputation. Data breach, quite common, from websites like Ashley Madison to financial information of customers coming out of the most conservative insurance companies. The problem with this is that in the case of Ashley Madison, which was an online dating site, information that was taken by the hackers were used to gain financial gain from the persons whose information was on this site. These are fairly high-profile people in business and government, and it causes, besides embarrassment, also reputation loss. On the other end of the spectrum, you have information of clients, which is taken out of insurance companies, for instance. We had a case where one of our clients twice were hacked for information purposes, and it causes mayhem because now actual transactional type information is out in the wide world. And it means that your financial position, your financial transactions are not safe. When it happens, the cost and the effort to advise clients, because you have to advise the clients immediately that this has taken place, and the cost and the effort to change that information to put them in a safer position is horrendous. And there's always the risk that you don't find it all, or you don't find all of your customers in time. It's a fairly serious thing, and remember again, it's the type of information that's being used to gain a financial advantage at a later stage or in a different forum. So when the information is lost, that's only the first wave. Information is lost, you must try and recover from that, but you don't know what is going to follow. There's that level of uncertainty, that avenue of uncertainty that's being created. The old favorite, CEO fraud, exploits certain vulnerabilities and weaknesses in Microsoft Outlook. You can change an email that's sent by somebody else to make it look like that person has sent it, but with a different message. So typically what happens in the CEO fraud is that an email is compiled instructing a junior officer in an organization to do a financial transaction, primarily to pay money to a controlled account by the scamsters, and they pretend that it comes from the CEO, and they actually get that email to send from the CEO's mailbox. So this thing plays on this natural tendency of a junior officer to follow instructions from a senior officer in an organization. I think the point I'm trying to make with CEO frauds is that there's a psychological aspect to cybercrime as well. It plays a lot on the mind and the expectations and sort of those things that's hardwired in people's minds. This is a typical example of it. Because when you get an instruction from a senior officer, and that instruction falls within the parameters of your understanding of what the relationship between you as a junior officer is to that senior officer, you will follow the instruction, and this is exactly what they get done. Banks, there are numerous examples, and there will be numerous examples of banks which were hit by cybercrime. In this case, this was a bank in South Africa a couple of years back, 2 years back. They lost money on a cash-out exercise in Japan. So typically, or basically what happened is that client information were extracted from the bank via a cyber attack. The information was then used to encode fresh plastics. The plastics were presented at banks in Japan and Hong Kong, primarily in Japan because there were no specific limits on the cash-out amounts in Japan. And then the message or the request for payment from the acquiring bank was sent through the MasterCard system to Standard Bank, where another cyber attack have resulted in a software which is being planted in the bank and was able to generate the authorization message, and the cash out takes place in Japan and Hong Kong. This was clearly done by a well-resourced and organized syndicate. They were able to get some of the best hackers on their job, and they were able to get a lot of runners in Japan, and they were managed because every time the cash out takes place, they've got to give the cash to somebody else where it gets centralized. Loss on this one was about 300 million rand, which is about 3 billion rupees. But over and above that, it took the bank a huge amount of time to fix the problem. And this is a bank which had one of the best protection systems in South Africa at the time. And I'll explain later how this happens. I'm just going to talk briefly about Stuxnet. It's a very controversial piece of software that was used. But Stuxnet is a 500 kilobyte military-grade computer worm that was used to access the centrifuges in Natanz in Iran. But what is frightening about this, and this was a 20-year-old, more than a 20-year-old computer program, it had the ability to independently look for a specific host in Natanz, which was the Siemens Step 7 software that was used there in order to manage the logical controllers of the centrifuges. The second thing is that it had obfuscation ability, so you cannot follow it, and it had anti-forensic capabilities. So it means that the artifacts that you normally find through a system when software is moving around your system in this way could not be traced. It wipes its own tracks out. And then, of course, it had the ability to change the way in which these logical controllers behaved. The idea was to break the centrifuges, and furthermore, that it generated false information about the performance of the centrifuges. Now, this is 20, 25, almost 30 years ago. Recently in a bank, we came across a piece of malware. It's called Volkvanger, and its derivative is called Valhalla, which exhibits pretty much the same attributes that Stuxnet did. And what this piece of malware did was it had the ability to deliver a mechanism which we were never able to establish exactly what it is, but deliver it into the network layers of the bank system. Now, normally what happens is that you find your malware in the application parts of the OSI stack. And that's normally where your defense system is. This malware delivered a mechanism in the network layer, and it would return authorization requests in the network layer. The bank was completely blind. it did not know that it was being attacked by a cash-out exercise, simply because its defense system never picked it up. The defense system operates, or in that case operated in the application layers, and they were able to do the transaction in the network layers. This is where the sophistication comes in. This is military-grade software that's being deployed into a financial environment, and being able to do things that we don't foresee or had not foreseen could happen. And it's also part of the evolution of the attack mechanisms that we find. I mean, previously it was very crude, where they will extract passwords from people working or people having accounts with a bank, to having software that provide authorization messages in the normal bank applications, and now they are able to inject mechanisms into the network environment. Very, very difficult to protect against. Right, so when we say, okay, so what is it that we do when an event like this happened and we now need to respond to it? So in the cyber defense environment, there are a number of responses, a number of things that need to be done. I want to talk to you about what we do when we investigate a cyber event. So typically, you still find the normal tradecraft applying, but the difference now is that whenever we think about the considerations of this environment, you know, how we plan for it, how we gather information, and how we analyze it, we need to understand that we now deal with a digital environment. So typically, the investigation methodology that one would apply remains the same, because you've got to understand that into the near future of this investigation phase, we still need to do things in courts. We still need to interact with insurers. We still need to interact with the management of the organization. So the process remains the same. The method, the how we do it changes. So the first thing that we want to look at is to get an understanding of the environment. Now, sometimes our clients would use an OSI format for their system. Sometimes it's a TCP environment. It doesn't really change. You still have the various phases or the various levels within which your system is being set up. We have to understand how they interact, what are all the endpoints, you know, what are the controllers, how does this mechanism work, where are the firewalls, are there any devices in your network which is not mapped? Clients always believe, and organizations always think that they've completely mapped their system and they're under full control of it until you actually start and you look at it. And here you'll find, well, they've put a sniffer on a wire that hasn't been there and it's not been mapped. There are a couple of endpoint devices on the system which hasn't been mapped and which the governance around it has also not been done. So it's important to get this done. Again, if you don't know the environment in which you have to do this investigation, you're not going to do a proper investigation, and that's why we have to know this. Then getting to the heart of the thing, traditionally we will have to do 3 pieces of analysis. One is to determine the attack vector and the method. The second one is to analyze the malicious software. That's if you find it, or if you find enough evidence of it, where, for instance, it becomes difficult if the malware that was used have got anti-forensic capability. Then you will only find bits and pieces, and it becomes a bit more complex to analyze it. And then thirdly, we do what we call impact analysis, and I'll get to that now. So when we want to determine the vector or the attack vector, it becomes critical that we have an understanding of what is it that we're going to analyze within the organization, and what do we analyze outside of the organization, and what is the way in which we deal with it. So inside the organization, there are a couple of ways that you can look at it. I'm just briefly going to talk about the Lockheed Martin kill chain. It's a method that was developed by Lockheed Martin Corporation, and it basically says, look, when an attack happens, there are certain steps, normally about 7, that the attack or the threat actor needs to take from cradle to grave. And the first step is that they've got to do reconnaissance of your system. So, as a response in the investigation, you will ask the question, so what is it that I expect to see when they do reconnaissance? And then you go and you look for that evidence. The second step after reconnaissance is that they will weaponize. Now, that sounds very military, but it's not really. What it means is that the malware that they intend using is being hidden in a file that you would normally transact quite frequently in your environment. And the reason why they would hide it in the file is to obfuscate the presence of the malware once they get it into your system. So once they've weaponized themselves, they now need to access your system. And, the old phishing email, which has been around for 2-3 decades, is still the best way of getting access to your system. And many clients think that, there's no way that my staff will be caught out by a phishing email until you do a test. And it comes through various ways. Social media and the invitation and the enticement of social media is one of the most powerful weapons available today to get people from an organization to correspond with cyber actors. And once they've started corresponding with you, the next thing is they send you an email. It's got normally a DLL type file attached to it, and embedded in that file is malware. The moment you open the file or it's received into the organization, this malware would launch into the organization. And that process is called exploitation. So now it will move, or if it's a remote access tool, it will be moved through the organization by way of remote access into the environment or the domain where the threat actor wants it to be deployed. Once it's there, it would be embedded. Once it's embedded, they will take or execute command and control functions to make sure that the threat actor is controlling that domain, and then they will action the thing and execute it. So those are the 7 steps that you will focus on in analyzing information about to determine what has happened. The second aspect of determining the attack vector and the method is to gather intelligence from outside of your organization. And the purpose of that is simply to get a perspective of what are the methods being used today, because that informs your ability to test the information within the organization and what's happening, for instance, in the Lockheed Martin kill chain. Then when we analyze malicious software, there's various ways that you look at it. So primarily, we will split it up between dynamic and static analysis of the software. Dynamic analysis entails that we actually put the software, if we have enough pieces of it or enough evidence on it, onto a live test bed, which is properly protected from the environment, and we then launch it, and we see what it does. And when we see what it does, we get a picture or indication of what it could have done at the time when it was properly and actively launched within your organization, and you start getting focus in where to look and what to do. In the static environment, there are 2 processes. The one is called a manual process, where you actually take the code that you could find, and you analyze it by virtue of a process called reverse engineering. And the purpose of that is to understand what each bit and piece of the software is doing, because that again informs us how it would behave and what it could do. Or we could take a technology angle to it, and we will sweep it with antivirus software like Norton or Kaspersky or McAfee, which will identify what it is that we're looking at. And then in the last instance, we perform impact analysis. So this is basically a data-driven exercise where we either analyze financial data coming out of the organization to understand what has this attack done to us. If it's a cash out, we will follow or identify cash flow If it's purely information which is departed the firm, we will identify the information flow, but that describes what has been done. And the second part of data analysis that we should not underestimate in a cyber environment or cyber investigation is that data package analysis becomes really important. Assume you can capture it. So many organizations don't capture data package movement for purposes of cyber attacks. They will do it for other purposes like marketing, but it's advisable that they should be implementing a proper data capturing exercise in the network layers, because the data flows that you find there might explain to you what has happened. In the case of the bank that I mentioned earlier on that were attacked, because the bank was blind, nobody could see what happened because nothing was recorded in the apps. But they had a sniffer over some of the load balancers, and we were able to take some of the data from that sniffer and analyze it, pure data analysis. Nothing to do with fancy cyber or software analysis. This was pure data analysis that allowed us to find out what has happened in this case. Okay, so I'm being told I've got 20 minutes. I think I'm probably around about there. So I thank you for your attendance. It's my privilege to speak to you, and it's my privilege to have come to Pakistan. Thank you.